Greetings, this is Craig Pepin, Project Lead for the Davis Grant. Thank you for listening to this audio recording from the Spring 2024 Competency Fellows Workshop Series. These workshops are funded by a grant from the Davis Educational Foundation, and together with other materials funded by the grant and available on the Competencies website, are designed to help enhance your understanding and learning of Champlain's college competencies. Today's workshop, titled Asking Real Questions, is led by Sheila Liming, our Inquiry Fellow.
Well, thanks for joining. I'm Sheila Liming, for those of you who don't know me or haven't met me. My presentation is pretty brief today. I'm kind of more just trying to start a conversation while also telling people a little bit about what the competency team has developed with regards to the rubric for the category of inquiry. I'm the Davis Grant Fellow for Inquiry, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And there's going to be some time for some discussion, questions, whatever you have. If you want to volunteer some examples later on in the presentation, and we can just kind of talk about that. So in the meantime, I'll talk at you for a little bit. And I'm going to do this neat little swivel thing with my chair like this, so I can manage two presentations at the same time. So what do we talk about when we talk about asking questions? I'm thinking of this as a discussion in three parts. Part one, how do we as teachers ask questions of our students? Part two, how do our students ask questions of themselves, of us as faculty, and of each other? And then part three, what do we need to do to make real questions happen, or basically to break beyond some of those like more superficial or surface level questions that we're all sometimes in the habit of receiving or even in, indulging in the classroom, and get maybe to the little bit more to the meat of inquiry. So I'm going to start off by talking about how we as teachers ask questions of our students. That's the first category here. Oops. Here we go. That's spacebar. It's kind of fun. Okay, so I'm starting from Pat Hutchings' Taxonomy of Questions, which is an article that Pat Hutchings, who's a scholar of teaching and learning, wrote in 2000 as the introduction to a book that talks about a kind of hierarchy of different types of questions that we ask both of ourselves in our teaching and also of our students when we're operating in the classroom. And Hutchings gives us four different types of questions, starting with what she calls what works questions. And she says what works questions are sort of like an initial entry point or a beginning place. She says this is where many faculty begin to assess their own teaching by seeking evidence about the relative effectiveness of different approaches. So basically a way of saying, what are we doing currently? And what kind of evidence do we see of what we're doing currently and how it's working, or what's coming out of it? The second type of question that she gives us are what she calls what is questions. And these are questions that are focused on the effectiveness of a particular approach and also describing what it looks like. So what its constituent features are. This is another way of saying that these questions are aimed at looking at something that already exists and trying to define it or understand it. So like, what is the process that we have in place for X? Or what is our general procedure surrounding Y? Something along those lines. And then as we move up the hierarchy, we get into some more complicated forms of questions. And one of them is what she calls what if questions. What if questions are visions of the possible. These types of questions focus on interrogating ideas of what could be. So ways we might change things, the ways that we would get different outcomes if we focused on different kinds of variables, that sort of thing. And then finally, the final type of question is what she calls what's missing questions. These questions are not so much about exploring an aspect of practice as they are about formulating new conceptual frameworks for formulating that thought about practice. So an example would be like, what forms of assessment would we need to develop in order to gauge or measure X? Or what would we need to do in order to get outcome Y? Something along those lines. That's really geared at like looking for gaps in current practice and what we're already doing. So just as an overview, that whole hierarchy ends up looking like this: what works, what is, what if, and what's missing questions. I'm going to talk about this first in terms of how we apply questions to what we do in the classroom as teachers, and then how our students ask these types of questions and how we want them to ask these types of questions in the work that they produce for us. Hutchings' taxonomy is used to define the scholarship of teaching and learning. It comes from the social field, but it can also be applied to pedagogic practice and what we do as teachers in the classroom when we model forms of inquiry for our students, and when we ask questions of them. So that's what I'm kind of interested in thinking about here today, is like how we're already applying these things in the classroom and modeling inquiry for our students. So I'm going to start by thinking about those what works questions and how these play out in the classroom. So I think these what works questions are often where we begin in classroom practice. They're those kind of get the ball rolling questions, like when we say something like, what struck you about this reading or this text or this movie that we watched together or this example that we all reviewed? What did you learn from it? What stood out to you? What did you notice? Or if I can borrow from Mike Lang's vocabulary, Mike Lang has this way of saying, what popped for you? And so I'm thinking about that too, as a way of talking about like, where these what works questions come from. And those are kind of the entry level ones. Those are where we begin to kind of get conversation off the ground a lot of times. I think the other side of the what works questions is what we can think of as what doesn't work questions. I have both people online and people here, so make yourself comfortable. And when we're asking questions about what doesn't work, we're basically interrogating the flip side of those what works questions. So this is when we're asking things like, what was confusing? What did you struggle with? What was hard about this project or this experiment or this assignment? And what works questions, as well as what doesn't work questions, open up space for a bit more interrogation, where we can kind of like think through some of those gaps that we're saying and maybe alter our practice a little bit to get at some better answers. That brings us to category 2. These are the what is questions. I'm doing this little slider thing. You like that? These questions seek definition, as we mentioned. So some examples are like, what is the meaning of blank? Or what is the author's definition of blank? Or what happens at the end of the story? Or what is the overall argument or point? These questions are usually geared towards getting pretty specific responses. They are solution-oriented, and if there's not necessarily one right or wrong answer, there's sort of like a spectrum of more correct answers and less correct answers relating to what we're getting at with the what is questions. And then that brings us to number 3. Next 3 is those what if questions again. And these are, again, about exploring the possible. So what if we changed this variable? What might be the results? Or what if we tried blank instead? Or what if the context is different? Would the argument stay the same? Or what if we need the result to be something very specific and we're not getting it? Instead of this, how would we get there? So these are our what if questions that we explore in the classroom in regards to student work. And then finally, category 4, that's the what's missing. And our what's missing questions include like, what have we overlooked? What assumptions have we been making? That's a big one. How have they prevented us from exploring other outcomes? And what do we need in order to achieve our desired outcome, to meet our desired target? If we could do it again, what would we change and do differently? So I'm going to show some examples of how these questions play out in like sample experiments in the classroom, assignments, projects, etc. And this is also something that, as the inquiry fellow for the Davis Grant, I'm also soliciting. I'm looking for examples of assignments, of project prompts, of writing exercises, anything that models how we ask these questions of students and like what kind of categories we see ourselves looking for when we do that too. So that's something that I'm going to be actively looking at as well. All right, so this is an example of an assignment that I was working with in one of my classes actually last week. So this assignment had students reading these short little books that are published as part of a series that's produced through Bloomsbury Press in association with The Atlantic magazine. And these series of books are short cultural histories of a particular popular cultural object. So for example, there's one on like the TV remote control, and there's one on like neon lighting, and there's one on sunglasses, and there's one on cigarette lighters. So they got to kind of choose a book from this series. So they got to sort of provide their own entry point for something they might be interested in. And then they were asked to give a report to the class, since they weren't all reading the same book, and basically tell us what they read about, what they noticed about the author's style, etc. So in this prompt that I have from Canvas, I have a whole different lineup of questions asking them to think about different things. And I'm just going to kind of pick out where some of them fall along the spectrum that I've been talking about. So starting with this one, or rather these ones, these are the what works questions that are getting at like, what's the current system or process that's in place? And how do you as a student or as a reader, how do you see that system playing out? So such as like, how is the book organized? How do they put together their information? Does the book present a single overarching narrative, or does it stitch together multiple narratives and stories explain? So 2 examples of what works questions there. But then we move on to the what is questions. These are a little bit more definition-based, such as what kinds of arguments, if any, are presented in relation to the object? What is the writing like? How would you define the style? How would you describe it? And what kinds of research did the author do in order to assess and explore the history of their object? Can you tell what those research methods were like? So those are all example questions under that heading there. And then moving along to what if. So what if questions, once again, direct us towards thinking about possible alternatives or answers. So what does the author not discuss in relation to the object, or what else would you have liked to learn about? This is kind of bridging into the last category of like the what else or what's missing category. But basically asking students to think about what could have been done differently, and maybe even how they would, as writers or as storytellers, how they might do this differently, how they might change the order that the information is presented in, or focus on certain stories instead of other ones, bring in different facts, different histories, whatever. And then that gets us into the fourth one, the what's else and what's missing one. So glad they gave me a roller chair. This would be impossible if I didn't have a roller chair. So this is what does the author not discuss in addition to what historical information, stories, et cetera, are missing, et cetera. So what else would we like to learn about? So this brings us into thinking about how students do this in our work, and how we are actually looking to assess the ways that they do this in their work. So I'm going to get into showing some examples from the competency rubrics that are specifically aimed at inquiry, and assessing for when we see this kind of inquiry or question asking in the student work that we receive. And so this is the intro spectrum here of how we are thinking about looking at inquiry. And you can see that it ranges from, on the right, not evident, to a certain type of inquiry not being there whatsoever in the student work, all the way over to the left, the green, which is exemplary. And then it has the criteria listed all the way on the left there in the gray colored box. So the criteria here says, develop questions, interacts with an idea, issue, context, i.e. a text, by independently developing questions that seek meaning while accepting ambiguity and nuance. And that acceptance of ambiguity and nuance is a big part of how we're defining proficient or exemplary from developing or emerging. Basically, are you looking for a wide spectrum of answers that may sometimes be vague or abstract or quite nuanced or complex, or are you looking for single answers? Yes, no, or here's a definition, or here's exactly the right answer to that question. So you can see that one of the things that we're highlighting here in this rubric is the correspondence between interaction with text and inquiry. So the idea that in order to understand the text itself, we're kind of getting inside it, and we're figuring out what questions we would want to ask of the text. Whether that text is something that we see as written, whether that text is a movie, a video game, a cultural work, something like that. So how we inquire and ask questions about it is a gauge of our interaction with it. And here's where we start to see the questions kind of separate into the categories I've been talking about here. So that criteria that I mentioned in the gray box, it's looking for a combination of the what is and what works questions with the what if and the what else questions, that kind of higher order thinking in addition to the definitional thinking. And so, for example, over there on the more right-hand side, the developing and emerging criteria categories, you see that there's a big emphasis on questions being solution-oriented. So that's the what is and the what works stuff, where we're really focusing on finding like a right answer or maybe a cluster of right answers that's going to solve this particular question or this particular line of inquiry. As opposed to some of these other categories that we're looking at that really focus on a little bit more of those open-ended questions. So for example, if we look at the difference between the exemplary category that says, recognizes that lines of inquiry are bounded by context and history, and that the process results are full of ambiguity. That's suggesting that we're looking for nuance, we're looking for complexity, and we're also looking for questions that lead to other questions, importantly too. And then over on the emerging side, you basically have the opposite of that. Formulates questions with the expectation of a single concrete answer. That's very much the what is approach. What is the answer to this single question? Or what is the definition of X? As we move along in the rubric, I'm just going to show some other examples of this. So I put in an example here of a question that could fall all across the spectrum. and fall into these different categories. Kind of thinking about this, like we could imagine it as a research question that might come up, say, in an independent research project of a student, a capstone, something like that. And what we're talking about is the connection here, hypothetically, between futurist art of the 1920s and 30s and Nazism, fascism, and the Weimar Republic. So way over on the not evidence side, we have a statement. We have the Nazis made futurist art, as many scholars have shown. So we have this kind of taken for granted connection between futurism and between Nazi politics. And then the emerging question, if we move just to the left there into the orange category, is a little bit more simplistic, but it's starting to tease apart that relationship. It says, are futurist art and the Nazi agenda connected? But once again, what we're seeing there is kind of like a yes or no based question that wouldn't necessarily open up to other lines of inquiry. And then in the yellow box, the developing section, we have what is the relationship between futurist art and Nazism, so getting a little bit more into the complex entanglements between the two. And then moving to the blue and the green, we have more complex ways that these questions are being asked. So under the blue, the proficiency one, how is futurist art related to the politics of the Weimar Republic? Where can we see examples of that relationship? So now we're replacing the Nazi agenda with a larger understanding of what was going on in Germany during this time period and thinking about it historically. And then all the way in the green part, how do the political and economic circumstances of the Weimar Republic contribute to the rise of futurism and the futurist aesthetic? And then turning that around, how does futurist art culture from that period in turn represent those political and economic realities? I use this as a question because a student in class recently asked me this question. And I was like, what an amazing question. Great job. It kind of like paused me in my tracks as we were talking about futurist art and sci-fi aesthetics. And, a kid raised his hand and was asking about, so like, how was the Weimar Republic, which I know was, kind of experiencing bad economic situations, how did that contribute to what we're seeing here, in this case, in Fritz Lang's Metropolis? So then we were able to kind of think through, okay, we have economics to consider, we have politics to consider, we have cultural reactions to consider, and then we also have cultural representations to consider, what they're showing us and what they're not showing us. So I thought it was a kind of good example of like teasing apart the complex side of this question, as opposed to just saying like, yep, Nazis, futurism, everybody knows that those two things go hand in hand. So this is a kind of an example of the way that the criteria of the rubric might be applied in thinking about these specific different types of questions. So here we can see that on the left, the exemplary and proficient categories are really emphasizing questions of how. So questions that are relating to process, cause and effect, relational development, history, complex factors, other social entanglements, that kind of thing. Really trying to get at the big picture. Whereas the middle question there, the yellow for developing, is a what question. It's a question about defining or determining something that already exists, assuming that the relationship has already been sort of discussed and talked about, and then figuring out how it's been discussed and talked about. And then finally, we have emerging down there on the other end of the scale, which says simply a yes or no question. Is there a relationship? How can we figure out what the relationship is? Might build that from there. But if it stops at just yes or no, then we want to like keep pushing that inquiry process a little bit further. I'm going to move pretty quickly through the other parts of the inquiry rubric because I think this first section is like the biggest section for us to consider here. But the other sections of the rubric are set up in a similar manner. So we can see this one here, for example, which has to do with research and exploration. You're going to see the same focus on those how questions that are aimed at getting at understanding a process versus those what questions here that are aimed at getting more concrete, basic answers. And then finally, that is our yes, no question that we see in the orange box there. So that's a similar way that all parts of the rubric, and the rubric has 4 categories devoted to inquiry, are kind of set up. That we want those big questions on the like more proficient side or the exemplary side, and the more kind of streamlined, basic, closed questions on the lower end there. And I'll just show you quickly the other 2 sections in the rubric so you can see that too. So the third section, it has to do with seeking evidence and how you put together the evidence that relates to the questions that you're following. And then also examination and reflection. So how we're critically examining assumptions and how those assumptions might actually steer the questions that we're able to ask with regards to a particular topic. Okay. Then that brings me to the final portion. What do we need to do to make these kinds of questions happen in the students that we teach, in our practices in the classroom, in the conversations that we have, in small groups, etc. And I have 3 kind of ideas here. And I'll be looking to see if anybody has thoughts on these ideas, examples of these ideas, if they want to volunteer assignments for my archive that I can use to think about how this is happening. And the first idea is through modeling expansive approaches to inquiry in the classroom itself. So basically that when we are standing in front of a classroom as teachers, when we're talking to students, we are in an active process of modeling that inquiry. And so the kinds of questions that we ask our students to answer are related to the kinds of questions that we want to see them asking themselves and asking each other as well, and asking, through their research that they might do. The second category that I have here is through the exploration of ways to assess and gauge inquiry in student work. So this basically falls into what we were talking about with the rubric, is how do we know it when we see it? How do we know the inquiry is happening? And how do we know what it looks like when we don't see it? What does that kind of student work tend to look like if it's not defined by this open or complex inquiry process? And then number 3 is through offering assignments, projects, experiences, etc., that create space for open-ended and multi-level inquiry. So thinking about what kinds of assignments avoid that yes or no kind of trap, or avoid those more sort of shallow, narrow-ended channels where we're just thinking about defining something specific or asking a what is question that's aimed to get at an existing solution, but more opening it up to those other questions that imagine alternatives or seek to assess gaps, that kind of stuff. So this is what I'm interested in talking about with you guys. If you have any ideas or suggestions about how you're currently doing this in the classroom, about how you want to do it in the classroom, about what kinds of barriers you find to getting students to ask these kinds of questions, any of that kind of thing. I am open to thoughts, open to questions, open to ideas along those lines. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen there and bring everyone back together here and see what kind of thoughts you have, if any. And just know that I'm dealing with people here in the room and people out there, but yeah, Josh raised a hand. Go ahead, Josh.
All right, I'll get things started. Maybe it'll
Thank you.
not everyone else. This is super cool because I couldn't figure out how a SOTL framework was going to then get applied.
We got there.
And I'm like, oh, now I get it. And so the thing that it jogged in my memory is one of the things I need to teach in terms of inquiry in my classes is if you're programming, your program doesn't always work. And
right.
You need an inquiry process to decide, where do I pursue the bugs?
Right.
And it's got to start. And what I liked about your framework, it's got to start with the shallow question.
Mm-hmm.
What's the error message that you got?
Right.
What does that error message mean? And then we can start scaffolding up to those what ifs of, well, what if I change it this way? What if I take this different approach? Let's see what happens when I do that. And so that's a piece of the process I know I need to model better for students, so it's really clear how to scaffold those questions. And so what I liked about that, the way you presented it, is I can clearly see that.
Good, yeah. And I like your point there too. I think those what works questions, or what doesn't work, or what kind of error message are you getting, are useful for that entry point, because that suggests that we then get to backtrack, right? We get to move from this kind of more shallow or specific understanding towards something bigger. Okay, and a mistake was made earlier on in the process, and we have to kind of move back in the process to find out where that occurred. Yeah, great point. Any other thoughts on how we're asking questions or not asking questions, or how our students are asking questions or not asking questions? I will admit that I find some of this to be progressive, meaning that I get different questions out of first-year students than I get out of seniors, right? And that student who asked me the question about the Weimar Republic the other day was a senior. He was very comfortable doing that kind of thinking by that point in time. But of course, that's exactly what we're seeking to see through the competency too, and to measure. So if we're looking at a DDL student with a self-designed degree and a self-designed capstone project, a question we can ask of it is how have those questions matured over time? How have they become more complex since maybe what they were interested in from day one?
I can go.
Yeah.
It's actually interesting because from this definition, I realized that in a lot of our upper level game art classes, there's a lot more inquiry going on than
I bet, yeah.
actually
Right.
think about, because there's so much of the, is it aesthetically successful? Why is it aesthetically successful? How can you make it more aesthetically? I can't say that.
Sorry to make you say that phrase 3 times.
But then also, like, from a technical point of view, based on what you're trying to achieve with the project, what are the different means that you can achieve that, which oftentimes involve doing some research on what different, possible ways to do something are, and then what would be the best of those ways to be using for the particular thing that you're trying to do. So I think,
I see what you mean.
By those this definition, there is actually a ton of inquiry going on in those upper level classes. And then in some of the, like in the 2B game art class, which is the sophomore class, which I used to teach, haven't taught for a couple of years, but there are 2 game art analysis projects that the prompts are similar to what your prompt was. And so, they choose a game to analyze the art. And, there's the prompts are things like, what's the art style? What are the influences on that art style? Is the implementation of the art style successful? If so, why? If not, what would you do differently?
See, that's a perfect example of a prompt that I would love a copy of. So that I can like put it in my, examples of like how this is working type of thing that I'm building. So yeah, that sounds great. And it's funny that you mentioned like the class being more inquiry based than you originally assumed. Josh sent out like invitations for this workshop today, right? To people who have inquiry marked as one of the major factors in their classroom for evaluations and stuff. And I was surprised that I got 2 of them. And I didn't remember that my classes were marked as being inquiry based, like 2 of my writing classes this semester. So I was like, oh, surprise.
Well, I know that like in all of our level game art classes, we have inquiry.
Right. Which makes sense. Yeah. Good point. Any other thoughts out there? Questions? You got a question, Scott? You look like you're ready to go.
I get to.
You don't want to talk about how Fritz Lang's Metropolis is related to the Weimar Republic?
I'm going to, actually.
Yeah, I know.
Well, that's a lot of the Russian.
Right. Yes, exactly. And then how can we extrapolate about our current moment, right? Good connections to be made there. Yeah. No, you can totally go if you have to run off. It's totally cool. Yeah. Thank you for coming. Yeah. Thank you, Murat. That's okay. I know people got to head out, so that's totally fine. Oh, but there's a question. Okay. Thanks. Well, among our people remaining, any other thoughts on this? It's totally cool if you don't. Like I said, this is in development, and we're actually revisiting the rubrics right now. We're just kind of playing with some of the wording on them to make them a little bit more clear. There's just some clunky verbiage in there, but we're sticking with those same 4 categories that we have. So hopefully making them a little bit more user-friendly. Okay, good. I love being efficient and short and sweet and not wasting people's time too much. So thank you guys for coming and talking a little bit about this. And you'll probably be hearing more about it too. So yeah, appreciate it. Okay. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Sheila.
Yeah, thank you very much.